The Aaron Rodgers era is ending in New York, and it was not a success. Let's take a look at why things did not work out with Aaron Rodgers today on Locked On Jets.
You are Locked On Jets, your daily New York Jets podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome. This is the Locked On Jets podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. It's Tuesday, February 11th, 2025, and I'm your host, John B. from GangGreenNation.com. Thank you so much for making the show your first listen or first watch every day. And a big shout out to you everydayers. This is a daily podcast covering the New York Jets with new episodes each day through the week, Monday through Friday. Well, the Aaron Rodgers era is ending in New York. On Sunday, Fox Sports' Jay Glazer reported that the Jets have decided to move on. The future Hall of Fame quarterback will not be back with the team in 2025. His 2-year tenure with the Jets was tumultuous and ultimately very unsuccessful. And I think it's important to look back as to why things did not work out, because I think there are always lessons you can take away from a failed experience like this. So we're going to talk about 3 reasons the Rodgers era was unsuccessful on today's episode. Now, the first reason it was unsuccessful, I think, is the obvious reason. Does it need to be stated? Well, we're going to state it. There was a ridiculous amount of bad luck after this trade for the New York Jets. Aaron Rodgers, in his first season with the Jets, played 4 snaps. And it was week 1 against the Buffalo Bills in 2023. It was a highly anticipated game. The Bills have been the team that had dominated the AFC East and have continued to dominate the AFC East. The Jets were viewed as an upstart team. They had just acquired this future Hall of Fame quarterback. The atmosphere in the stadium was electric. And then 4 plays into the season, Rodgers suffers an Achilles injury, which ends his first year with the Jets. And the New York Jets, over the last 14 years, have been a team that really has embodied the phrase poor execution meets ridiculous luck, because you could not script that. I remember when Rodgers first suffered that injury, when it looked like he was injured, I just kind of laughed. And it wasn't because I thought it was funny. Obviously it wasn't. It was a really devastating moment. If you were a Jets fan, I mean, you remember how crushing this was. I remember my uncle told me last year at Thanksgiving that Rodgers ran onto the field with the American flag that night, and he was as fired up as he's ever been with a Jets fan. And then just a couple minutes later, it's back to being the Jets. It's the same stuff that always happens with this team. And I chuckled, because what other team could something this ridiculous happen to? You spend your entire offseason working out this trade for this future Hall of Fame quarterback. There's so much excitement around the team. There's so much buzz. You're on Hard Knocks. And then this happens. And I have to be honest with you. I was a huge skeptic of this trade for a lot of reasons. But, when the 2023 season began, how could you not have been fired up about this team? Even if you had reservations about the deal, even if you had reservations about the path the Jets had taken, even if you had reservations about some of the moves the team had made that offseason, even if you had some reservations about what it meant for the future. And I had all these reservations, but by the time the season begins, you're ready to go. You're fired up. You're like, okay, we've got this future Hall of Fame quarterback. And then he goes down 4 plays into the season. And you never really get that. This thing never really got off the ground for reasons that just come down to luck, because that's just, an Achilles injury. It's just a pure chance injury. Now, Rodgers did kind of take a hit on that play, and there's this discussion. Duane Brown kind of missed his block. Maybe Rodgers held onto the ball for too long. But your left tackle missing a block typically doesn't result in a season-ending injury to your quarterback. Your quarterback holding onto the ball for too long and maybe missing a read, or maybe not throwing the ball when he should, that usually doesn't result in a season-ending injury. It was just an unbelievable turn of events. And then the Jets had to go to Zach Wilson. And, we could talk a lot about the decision to bring Zach Wilson back as the backup quarterback in 2023. And you can go back to what I said that summer before the season, that I felt like it was a very ill-advised decision, both for the Jets and for Zach Wilson. I felt like the Jets needed a higher caliber backup quarterback than Zach Wilson. And I felt like if the Jets were being honest, I felt like if the Jets were actually honestly trying to develop Zach Wilson as their heir apparent, it was very foolish to put him into a situation where he was one snap away from needing to go back into the lineup, because it seemed to me like Zach Wilson was the type of quarterback who, if he was ever going to turn it around, probably needed to sit for multiple seasons. But, at the end of the day, when your starting quarterback goes down 4 plays into the season, your season's probably finished at that point. I think the Jets deserve criticism for a lot of things, but ultimately, the amount of bad luck you have to have for that to happen is just unreal. I mean, even in 1999, the Jets had a similar situation where they thought they were a Super Bowl contender. They probably were a more legitimate Super Bowl contender in 99, because that 2023 team did have other issues that went beyond losing Rodgers. But, we never even really found that out for sure. But, in 1999, the Jets lost their starting quarterback, Vinny Testaverde, in the first game of the season, but they at least made it to the second quarter. You at least had one good quarter of football in week 1 before you lost your quarterback for the season. The Jets did not have that. And while there are situations where, a backup quarterback rallies a team going forward, I mean, that same 1999 season, the Rams did that. They lost their starting quarterback, Trent Green, to an injury in preseason. Kurt Warner took over and led the team to the Super Bowl. 2 years later, New England lost Drew Bledsoe early in the season, and that's where Tom Brady took over. But most of the time, you don't have a secret Hall of Fame quarterback lurking on the bench the way those teams did. And we knew that the Jets did not with Zach Wilson. But at the end of the day, it doesn't matter if you actually had a quality backup quarterback. So much was built around Aaron Rodgers. The Jets essentially built everything around, and we can talk about whether or not that was actually a good idea, but to not even have a chance to see it work in 2023, the first season you do it, after such an offseason of excitement, after all of those moves, and it's just because he took a bad step on the MetLife Stadium turf. It's just unreal. And that's the Jets make a lot of missteps as a franchise. I'm not denying that. I mean, if you're a regular listener to the show, I don't deny that. I don't deny that the Jets make a lot of foolish decisions. And there are some foolish decisions we're going to discuss later in this episode that also helped to derail the Rodgers era with this team. But man, it's just you think back on that, and in the moment, it felt ridiculous. And here we are, a year and a half later, and it feels just as ridiculous. I mean, can this team ever catch a break? New York Jets, it's where bad execution meets ridiculous luck. And there's a lot you can say bad about that 2023 team. There's a lot of criticism that team deserves. There's a lot of criticism the Jets deserve for putting that team together. There definitely were some missteps, but you just have to take a step back and look at the bad luck this team had to lose your starting quarterback 4 plays of the season after building so much around him, after so much went into that year. And I think any objective analysis of the Rodgers era has to discuss the fact that he missed half of his time with the team due to a freak injury that he suffered as soon as he set foot on the field. Life as a Jets fan, am I right? Now, here on the Locked On Jets podcast, we're going to talk about another factor as to why the Rodgers era did not work out. And this one was more in the Jets' control. It has to do with one of the most basic elements of football. And in both seasons, the Jets failed to fortify the trenches. Different years brought different failures in different trenches. We'll explore all that as we continue here on this Tuesday edition of Locked On Jets. Today's episode of Locked On Jets is brought to you by Prize Picks. Football season may be over, but basketball is in full swing, and there's no better way to stay in the game than with Prize Picks, the best place for daily fantasy sports. With Prize Picks, you pick more or less on at least 2 player projections. If you're right, you win up to 1,000 times your cash. Download the app today and use code LOCKEDONNFL to get $50 instantly after you play your first $55 lineup. That's code LOCKEDONNFL. It's one word with no space. And again, it gets you $50 instantly after you play your first $5 lineup at Prize Picks. Again, and with Prize Picks, you pick more or less on at least 2 player projections. And if you're right, up to 1,000 times your cash. Prize Picks, run your game. Thank you so much for making Locked On Jets your first listen or first watch every day. A big shout out to you everydayers. This is a daily podcast covering the New York Jets with new episodes each day through the week, Monday through Friday. On today's show, we're talking about some of the reasons Aaron Rodgers' 2-year tenure with the Jets was not successful. And There are a lot of reasons. It's a very complicated thing to get into. But I think near the top of the list is the way the Jets handled the trenches in Rodgers in the two off seasons where Rodgers was here. And in each of those two off seasons, I think they failed in a different way to fortify their lines. In the 2023 offseason, it was really inconceivable to me the way they handled the offensive line because you had Rodgers coming in here, but he was 39 years old. And even before the Achilles injury, even that last season in Green Bay, you could tell that he wasn't moving at the same level he was early in his career. And the Jets entered the 2023 season with Duane Brown at left tackle, who was 38, and Mekhi Becton, who was coming off essentially two missed seasons due to injury at the right tackle position. And, it's easy to second guess these things, but this is not a second guess. I mean, it's pretty easy to first guess the issues that could arise from that because Brown had a long and distinguished career, but he had been with the Jets in 2022. And you could see that they probably were getting the last bits of good football from him that season. He did a serviceable job. He was kind of an emergency signing after Becton got injured. And, he stabilized the line to an extent, but you could see his play was going downhill, that he was no longer the Pro Bowler he was with the Texans and with the Seahawks earlier in his career. And Becton, Becton went to Philadelphia. He was part of a Super Bowl team this year. He was part of one of the best offensive lines in the league, but he was a guard. He was playing a much lower impact position. He was on a team with an excellent offensive line coach opposed to Keith Carter, who was the worst offensive line coach in the league. And he was surrounded by a lot of talent in Philadelphia. It's one thing for Becton to be the fifth best player on a great offensive line with great coaching at the guard position. It's another to ask him to play the right tackle position with Keith Carter coaching. And the thing is, as we discussed in the first segment, it was ridiculous luck for the Jets to lose Aaron Rodgers 4 plays into the season. But I'm not sure the season would have been successful even if Rodgers had stayed healthy. And part of me has always felt like, in a way, Joe Douglas and Robert Saleh got off the hook because of Rodgers' injury, because it kind of hid some of the mistakes they made that offseason, particularly not building up the offensive line, because the line was an issue. And, you had Laken Tomlinson coming back at the left guard position. It was just not a very good offensive line. You had Connor McGovern playing center, and then Joe Tippmann was stepping in to take over for him. You had Elijah Vera Tucker, who went down early that season with an injury. But the offensive line was not in working shape. And with a 39-year-old quarterback, with a guy who, wasn't moving as well as he was early in his career, having a good offensive line in front of him was paramount. And it's like the Jets made no moves. The Jets didn't do anything to upgrade their offensive line. An offensive line that, frankly, had not been that good the year before. And I think this goes back to, something we discussed on yesterday's show about how maybe the Jets got it into their heads that Rodgers would fix everything, that, maybe his ability to do the hard count would make pass blocking easier. But it was just amazing to me how the Jets didn't try and upgrade any other aspect of their team heading into the 2023 season. And if Rodgers had stayed healthy, I think there would have been issues with this team. Now, of course, Rodgers didn't stay healthy, so we'll never know. But again, I feel like the regime got off the hook because Zach Wilson was a problem, but Zach Wilson essentially took the whole brunt of the blame when there were other issues on the football team. So the Jets really failed to build up it's like they didn't even it's not even they failed to build up the offensive line. They failed to make any moves to upgrade an offensive line that simply was not good enough the year before. And then we go to 2024. And the Jets actually do a pretty good job with their offensive line that offseason because they signed John Simpson, who really looks like an excellent signing. They draft Olu Fashanu, who looks like a real player. They get Morgan Moses back in a trade, who does a very solid job at the right tackle position. Tyron Smith is kind of a miss, but even Tyron Smith, it's not like he was the worst left tackle in the league. He was a below average tackle. We grade him on a curve. We grade him compared with peak Tyron Smith, and obviously there was a deep downgrade. But even Tyron Smith wasn't a total disaster. And in many ways, he kind of bought Olu Fashanu the half season he needed to get ready to step into the starting lineup. Unfortunately, the Jets failed on the other line. And we were talking about the defense backsliding. There are lots of reasons for that. But I think near the top of the list is the way the defensive line went from being a strength in 2023 to a weakness in 2024. I mean, by the end of the season, it felt like the Jets had two quality offensive linemen, Quinnen Williams, who was having a down year, and Will McDonald, who's a very good pass rusher, but a guy who gets exposed if you play him too much because he can't stop the run at all. And you look at the guys the Jets let out the door. Now look, in 2024, Jermaine Johnson did suffer an injury. Jermaine Johnson's like kind of the Jets' most complete defensive end because he can both rush the passer and play the run. But you look at the guys the Jets let go over the course of the 2024 offseason. And the one that just drives me crazy is John Franklin Myers, who they gave away to Denver for reasons that still aren't clear. They said it was a salary cap move, but the Jets spent 2 years essentially saying the salary cap doesn't matter. We don't care how much we're restricting ourselves in the future. We're going all in. And then John Franklin Myers is the spot where they draw the line. That didn't really make a whole lot of sense. It was kind of a confusing move. And the Jets let JFM go, and they don't really have a replacement because JFM was another guy. He helped you in both areas. He was a guy who ate up a lot of space, so he kept your linebackers clean. And when you're playing a Robert Saleh style defense, you want to have a lot of speed on the back seven, which means typically you're going to be playing smaller guys because smaller guys are faster. You need someone to absorb those blocks, and the Jets never really replaced JFM. The Jets kind of talked themselves into believing Michael Clemens could play that role, but he couldn't. Michael Clemens was a guy who could play a handful of snaps if JFM needed a rest, but he wasn't good enough to handle a full-time starting role at the defensive end spot. And then, I don't want to go too crazy about Bryce Huff because Bryce Huff did nothing with the Eagles. I do think maybe he was a better fit for a Robert Saleh defense where he could get in that 4-point stance and just fire up the field. I mean, Bryce Huff is essentially a one-dimensional guy. He's got the fastball. He's got the speed rush. You get him into the 4-point stance, let him fire up the field. Don't make him worry about playing the run. Play him in a part-time role. He'll be really good. Maybe he's not as good as a fit in a Vic Fangio defense. But, you also look at what the Jets, guys the Jets brought in, namely Hassan Reddick, which simply did not pan out. Hassan Reddick was a really poor decision. Looking back on it, there were things we didn't know that the Jets did know. How the Jets made the trade, and it seemed like everybody knew Reddick wanted a new contract. I thought it was obvious the Jets were going to give him a new contract. Thank goodness they didn't because we saw what a disaster this was. But the trade itself was a really awful deal for the Jets. I mean, the Jets gave up a third-round pick for practically nothing. Reddick did zero with this team. And you look up and down this defensive line. The signing of Javon Kinlaw did not pan out. Leki Fatu, they brought him in to be a defensive tackle. That did not pan out. Essentially, nothing the Jets did worked on the defensive line. And you look at the failures for the 2024 Jets. Well, there were team-wide failures. And look, Rodgers has to own his part in that. The passing game was very limited, and Rodgers had a lot to do with that. The coaching was abysmal. But football, in many ways, is a game that comes down to the trenches. I mean, you saw it in the Super Bowl the other day. Chiefs couldn't block anybody on Philadelphia. The Eagles dominated the game. And while the Jets' failures in 2024 were complex, a big part of it was the way the defensive line backslid. And that was the result of an offseason where the Jets just did nothing right on the defensive line. So you look at the 2 years. 2023, of course, Rodgers gets hurt. If he doesn't get hurt, Jets' failures on the offensive line probably would have sunk that team anyway. 2024, lots of reasons the Jets failed, but I think one thing that doesn't get discussed enough is the failures to build out in the trenches on the defensive side of the ball. Now, here on the Locked On Jets podcast, we'll talk about one more reason this Rodgers era went off the tracks, and it has to do with what was, in many ways, a panic decision by the Jets, a decision to make a big change during the season. We'll go into more detail on that as we continue here on this Tuesday edition of Locked On Jets. Today's episode of Locked On Jets is brought to you by FanDuel. When the game tips off, the NBA action is just getting started, and there's no better place to get in on it than FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. With FanDuel, you can place live bets through the game, so even if you miss the opening tip-off or want to bet on a fourth-quarter comeback, you can stay in the action. If you're looking for a bigger payout, you can combine your live bets into a same-game parlay. And right now, FanDuel customers can get $150 in bonus bets if your first $5 bet wins. Again, it's $150 in bonus bets if you win your first $5 bet. Just visit FanDuel.com to join today. That's FanDuel, FanDuel.com, FanDuel.com for your shot at $150 in bonus bets. Make every moment more with FanDuel, the official sports betting partner of the National Basketball Association. This is the Locked On Jets podcast on this Tuesday. We're looking back at the Aaron Rodgers era, which is about to end for the Jets. Jay Glazer of Fox Sports reported on Sunday that the Jets are moving on without Aaron Rodgers in 2025. I think by any measure, this was an unsuccessful era. The Jets go 7-10 without Rodgers in 2023 because of a freak injury, and then 5-12 with Rodgers in 2024. Both sides could probably use a fresh start. Why did this era fail? Well, there are no simple answers, but there are some pretty big reasons. And I think you look back to the 2024 season, the Jets made what can only be described as an erratic move 5 games into the season. And maybe saying the Jets made it is not accurate because it was really the owner. The owner made a unilateral decision 5 games into the season when the Jets were 2-3, coming off a tough loss to the Minnesota Vikings in London, to fire head coach Robert Saleh. Now, if you're a longtime listener to this show, you know that I don't have any particular love for the way Robert Saleh coached this team. In fact, I felt that the Jets should have moved on from Robert Saleh after the 2023 season. I felt like it was very difficult to justify bringing Robert Saleh back for the 2024 season. I'll take it a step further. It became very clear to me early in the 2023 offseason that the Jets probably made a mistake not just cleaning house after the end of the 2022 campaign, because it just felt to me like things were really going on a bad track with the previous regime. But once you bring back Robert Saleh for 2024, you stick with him until the team's out of the playoff race, because there's an old saying, a flawed plan beats no plan. And when the Jets made the coaching change, it was clear that there was no plan. Woody Johnson apparently did not consult with the front office at all. He just decided he was going to make a change, and he did not think things through. He promotes Jeff Ulbrich. Now, I think it's tough to argue with the job Ulbrich did as defensive coordinator in 2022 and 2023. The Jets were one of the top defenses in the league those 2 years. Now, how much was it Ulbrich? How much was it Saleh? How much was it the personnel? That's a fair question. But I think it's difficult to criticize the job Ulbrich did, if nothing else. But you take Ulbrich, who's the defensive coordinator, and you make him the head coach. You don't really have anybody in place to run the defense. Because, if it was a joint venture between Saleh and Ulbrich, well, you're taking Saleh out of the mix. That means Ulbrich has more responsibilities on defense. But on top of that, you're adding responsibilities to running the team, managing the games, overseeing the coaching staff. You're just putting too much on Ulbrich's plate. And Ulbrich made a bad decision. Ulbrich decided he was going to continue to run the defenses rather than delegate it to somebody else. In some ways, I can actually kind of understand why Ulbrich made the decision that he did, because his mindset may have been it would be too dramatic of a change if like you lose Saleh and then Ulbrich takes a back seat on the defense. Maybe there's just too much change. But this is the problem. Like, the owner didn't think any of these things through. If you were going to fire Saleh, there should have been a plan for the defense. Either Ulbrich hands off the reins to somebody else, or maybe you promote somebody else. Maybe you elevate a different coach to be the head coach for the rest of the season. One of the things I thought was odd was in 2021, Robert Saleh missed a game because he had COVID, and the Jets elevated tight ends coach Ron Middleton to run the team during that game. And I would imagine part of the reason for that was that if you elevate Ulbrich, his attention is being pulled from the defense, a defense which is already kind of shorthanded coaching wise because Saleh is not there. There was no plan here. And look, I don't think Robert Saleh is a great coach. I don't even think he's a good head coach. I think he's a great defensive coordinator. In fact, if anybody asks me what were Saleh's good qualities as Jets head coach, I'd pretty much give you the qualities of a good defensive coordinator. He was a good defensive architect. Jets understood what personnel they needed to run their scheme. They seemed like they developed players pretty well on that side of the ball. Robert Saleh wasn't a good head coach. But the question for the Jets 5 games into the season wasn't Saleh versus a good head coach, because you weren't going to be able to hire a good head coach 5 games into the season. The question was Saleh versus another coach on the coaching staff who wasn't Saleh, whether it was Ulbrich or Ron Middleton. And I think the answer to that is clearly Saleh was I'm not going to say the better option, but Robert Saleh was the less bad option because he at least had been a head coach. And I think part of the problem, like with elevating Jeff Ulbrich, was that he really didn't have the typical time to transition into being a head coach. Most of the time somebody's hired as a head coach, they have like a full offseason to think about how they're going to implement their team, how they're going to manage games, how they're going to supervise the coaching staff. This stuff's really important. That time can really help you, avoid pitfalls. And Ulbrich didn't have that. Ulbrich was just thrown into this chaotic situation where he had to save its team season on the fly. It was never going to work. And you watch this Jets team through the season, and it wasn't like they had bad coaching. It was at points it felt like they weren't coached at all. You just felt like you didn't have a coach at all. it was an erratic decision to remove Saleh. And, I'll go back to something I've said frequently over the last couple of months. One of the frustrating things is that it's not like Saleh displayed new negative traits the first 5 games of the season. Everything you did not like about the first 5 games of the season was already on display in 2022, 2023, 2021. We already knew his flaws, and suddenly, like 5 games into the season, Woody Johnson decides that these flaws are significant enough to make a change when they weren't significant enough to make a change after the 2023 season. And coaching matters in the NFL. I think maybe sometimes we overstate how significant it is. And I don't think you can say coaching was the only reason the Jets failed in 2024. But I think any chance the Jets had of turning it around essentially ended the day Woody Johnson decided to impulsively change coaches 5 games into the season, because it just doesn't work in the NFL. It's very rare you find a situation where an interim guy is able to step in and turn this situation around. And in those, and when in the few instances where it does happen, typically it's a guy with experience. Typically it's a guy who's been there before, because you don't want a first-time head coach to have to figure these things out on the fly. You want to, on-the-job training is really tough in a situation where you're actively trying to win games. And the Jets put themselves in a really awful spot by the way they handled these things. And, look, there were lots of reasons the Jets failed in 2024, and Rodgers' plays among them, but the erratic nature of the owner, particularly making the coaching change, is probably near the top of the list. Anyway, that's all for today's episode. This has been the Locked On Jets podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day is our motto. As always, if you enjoy the show, hit the subscribe button where you're watching or listening so that you'll never miss an episode. If you enjoy the show and are listening on a podcast source, please give it a 5-star review. And if you're watching on YouTube and enjoy the show, give this episode a big thumbs up. Helps us out, helps other Jets fans find the podcast. Enjoy your Tuesday, everybody. Send in your mailbag questions. Unless there's major breaking news, we're planning on doing our Wednesday mailbag. Can't wait to answer your questions then. Talk to you later.